Normally I think pretty highly of Western Digital's hard drives, so much so that when I had the opportunity to obtain a Linksys network storage link, I paired it with two Western Digital drives, a 500 and a 750 gigabyte, which I later acquired for $112, which is a pretty good deal. And while I generally think very highly of Western Digital's drives, it's obvious that someone was thinking, how can I make this Enclosure cheap while it still looks cool? In fact, with the 750 gigabyte drive, they even did away with the power button on the front and didn't say anything about it in the instructions. So if you've had one of these drives in the past, it was quite possible to inadvertently push that thing right into the casing. But one problem with this, although it is ventilated at both top and bottom in cool Morse code, which I've heard there is actually a typo in, it seems that these get very hot, especially when you put them on top of a network switch, as I did. So what I'm going to do today is show you how to open up your Western Digital MyBook hard drive, which should apply to all the editions, although this one is just the basic USB 2.0 version, and put it in an enclosure that offers better cooling. Okay, the first thing to do is to get a bladed screwdriver that's fairly clean. This one's had some use, but it's in good shape. And then insert it into the cabinet and gently pry apart on this. Now, I strongly suggest that if you value what's on your MyBook hard drive, you may want to take a backup. And you should also realize that, at least in theory, this does void the warranty. But if you're careful, and you pry it open gently, as I'm doing here, you shouldn't have too much trouble getting it back together. You'll have to pry around both sides of the cabinet, being sure not to poke the screwdriver too far in, or you might damage the drive or its electronics. I guess if you feel so inclined, you could use the case for something else, but I'd rather not trust it. After all, it does get very hot in operation, and there's no fan. Once you get the enclosure to crack open, it just slides apart. And then you'll find a conventional either serial ATA for late models, such as this one, or a parallel ATA drive. Now it's time to take that drive out. Okay, there will be plenty of screws to remove while you're doing this, and at least on a drive that's never been apart before, Western Digital fastened the screws extremely tightly, so to avoid rounding off the heads, use a good screwdriver. You'll need to remove a screw here, here, down here near the power LED, and here at the bottom. Over on the other side, there are two more, but there'll have to be a little more disassembly done before you can get at them. At the lower portion of the drive, toward the bottom of the enclosure, there's a wonderfully hidden screw that I forgot to mention, so make sure you get it too. When you have all the screws out, the drive will gently pivot out in its cage. At this point, you can unplug the serial ATA connector and loosen all four screws around the perimeter of the drive. The drive will then be free after you do. When you have the drive out, and if you bother to disassemble and open this bottom cage, or you could just use it as it is, you'll find a nice little serial ATA to USB bridge board that runs off of a single 12-volt power supply that came bundled with the drive. It might be handy for another project, such as a test bed, so you might want to hang on to that. Anyway, when you do finally have your drive out, it's time to put it in another enclosure. For the best possible result, use an enclosure that's got a fan and a metal-bodied casing to help it dissipate heat. It might also be a good idea, depending on your needs, to pick an enclosure that supports external serial ATA connectors, so you can plug your drive in periodically to an external serial ATA card and query its health via the smart technology that most drives support these days. Put your enclosure together and follow the directions included in its box. When you're done, your Western Digital MyBook hard drive, which is really no longer a MyBook hard drive, will now be much more reliable and operate in a much cooler way. There you go. Now your Western Digital hard drive that was originally in its insufficiently cooled MyBook enclosure will have a cool, long, and happy life.